Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out to hear Raven Leilani read from her novel, Luster. I'm Stephanie Swallow, and I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Creative Writing Program here. And before I introduce Raven, I want to thank Michael Fisher, Annette Lepeak, and especially Starsha Gill for helping us to put together these events and making them run smoothly and safely. We couldn't do it without them. And now to Raven. Raven Leilani's work has been published in Granta, the Yale Review, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, Conjunctions, The Cut, New England Review, and other publications. She has her MFA from NYU and was an Axon Foundation writer in residence. She had her fiction debut last year in 2020 with Luster, which you may have read, and if you haven't, then I highly recommend you do. It's a novel about a 20-something Black woman in New York whose daily life and work, her crappy rodent-infested apartment, and her empty admin job, and her freewheeling sexual encounters are utterly incommensurate with her profound desires for intimacy and for art, and for, as she herself describes in the last pages of the book, for someone to, with merciless, deliberate hands, put me down onto the canvas so that when I'm gone, there will be a record, proof that I was there. Zadie Smith writes that Luster is a daring, perverse, wildly funny book about how we use each other, especially how the old use the young, socially, economically, and intimately. And Kirkus Review calls it, quite rightly, sharp, strange, propellant, and a whole lot of fun. Luster was awarded the Kirkus Prize for Fiction, the Center for Fiction's first novel prize, and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction. So that's quite a debut, I have to say. So please help me welcome Raven Leilani.
Thank you for that introduction. That was so lovely, and thank you all for coming out. My book came out last year in the middle of the pandemic, and so I haven't really had a chance to do events like these and feel this kind of human energy. So it really means a lot. Thank you for bringing me out and for coming out. So I'm going to read sort of a middle section, so it requires some prefacing. I'm going to start a section where Edie, the narrator, has lost her job and is seeking a supplement, seeking a new job, and in the meantime, she's fielding these texts from a man she's seeing. In the brief window of service between Manhattan and Brooklyn, Eric sends me a photo of a friar fleeing a baboon. He writes, "At this archival conference in Toronto and saw this illuminated text. Pages are swollen. Binding is beyond reinforcement. This thing is nearing the end of its life. You can practically smell the rot." Having already been in the process of filing him away, burying him with the other men who evaporate after pulverizing my cervix, I'm relieved. And yes, I'm ashamed. I want to say that I'm not that kind of girl, portable, contorting myself over an inaccessible, possibly disinterested man. But what if I am? There are worse things. Factory farming and Christian rock and three-dimensional animation, Mr. Clean. Because maybe I don't want to be cool. Maybe I want to be all-purpose. Maybe I can't pretend to be aloof to men who are aloof to me. So I text him 200 words worth of things I know about baboons. When I arrive home, I can't extend my fingers. I rinse my hand after washing it with a little Irish Spring, and I look for some toilet paper, but we are out. I look for a t-shirt to wrap my hand in, but I have no clean clothes, and I have been putting off doing laundry by wearing my bathing suit as underwear. So I find some raw canvas in the back of my closet, wrap it around my hand, and take my paintings out with the trash. I stop at the corner grocery, spend $6 on a package of good soft toilet paper, $4 on a large store-brand carrot cake. I consider buying a box of Band-Aids, but even the generic brand costs more than I want to spend. I strip down to my bikini and stop by the laundromat, where I spend $4 on a standard wash and dry and make a few calls about my student loans. I portion out my last paychecks on the back of my hand with a Sharpie while the rinse cycle goes, and something about how this arithmetic sprawls on my arm makes me feel like I can make it work. When I return home, a mouse has started on my carrot cake, so I make some instant oatmeal and retreat to my room, where I listen to my roommate and her feminist boyfriend having very sweet sex. I work on my resume, slip in vague communications role peddling paraben-free dog shampoo, and to show I have character, I stick to the facts regarding my month at Murray's, where I mongered an array of soft cheese. I throw in some blatant lies and make sure any inconsistencies are small enough to explain away once I have a foot in the door and am armed with enough recon on my interviewer to either have talking points on the company culture or a 5-point plan to suck dry any available reservoirs of white guilt. I interview well despite my nerves, and while I wish I could take credit for that, my ability to maintain human form and make a good impression is all about my skin. The expectations of me in these settings are frequently so low, it would be impossible not to surpass them. I send a few applications out, wrap my hand in some fresh toilet paper, and for a few hours I manage to sleep. I have a dream about the bones in my skull liquefying, and when I wake up and see my laundry basket, something about the inevitability of dirty clothes, of the sebum and discharge, of the finite number of quarters fills me with panic. And this is not so bad. Some nights I lie awake and the sky presents an entire anatomy that makes me feel hopeless and sometimes like a spider is crawling across my face. But tonight feels different. Tonight I am suspended in a lurid loop in which the ground is always rushing upward, the Japanese demon squatting on my chest, lengthening to its full height, peeling back its long buttocks to reveal a fully functioning eye. I think of my parents, not because I miss them, but because sometimes you see a black person above the age of 50 walking down the street, and you just know they have seen some shit. You know that they are masters of the double consciousness, of the discreet management of fury under the tight surveillance and casual violence of the outside world. You know that they said thank you as they bled, and despite the roaches and the instant oatmeal and the bruise on your face, you were still luckier than they have ever been, such that losing a bottom-tier job in publishing is not only ridiculous, but offensive. In the morning, no jobs have contacted me, but there is a text from Eric accompanied by a photo of a fully erect seraphim. He writes, "Take a look at that grass. The color is called verdigris, and they used to make it by boiling copper and vinegar." And I don't respond because I can't bring myself to do anything but get up and go to the bathroom, and even this is something I have to convince myself to do, because I have not once wet myself in adulthood, and I think perhaps I'm due. A couple of days later after that, I put some water in a glass and drink it, and Eric sends me a picture of a chimera with a star-shaped tongue. He writes, "In the tradition of the grotesque, the art of the grotesque, but how cool is this? In the beginning, grotesque just meant ornate." And I send out a few job applications and take a shower. I start to shave my legs, but on the second leg, the lights turn off and I stand there in the dark with the razor, feeling like the universe is suggesting something. Eric texts me more photos of gargoyles and vagina dentata and no jobs callback, even when I revise my resume daily and spend $28 on a pantsuit. By the time I feel able to contribute to the conversation, it becomes obvious that it is not a conversation. It becomes obvious that he does not intend to acknowledge the terrible night I spent in his home. The texts come intermittently and without prompting, though Eric usually sends them around noon and midnight, which tells me that I occurred to him during lunch and perhaps while he is still in bed. In between these texts, I want to ask him what he's eating. I want to ask him why he's awake. But then I worry he'll remember I'm on the other end and the text will stop. This is the way it was when our relationship only existed online. We told each other things so awful, by necessity we adopted the posture of speaking in jest, though we had gone through the trouble to create a language, and the effort of this alone betrayed our seriousness. And then we met. Then I got in his car and had to recalibrate, give him eyelashes and veins under his hands and a freckle on his chin, and suddenly it seemed indecent to acknowledge any of the things we'd said. And so when he texts me a photo of a satyr being skinned and says, "Dig the saffron and the gold leaf, we use a synthetic compound to counteract the pores," I say nothing. Some days later, I snag an interview for a corporate gig in Long Island City, but when I get there, it is just a staffing firm, and the woman I meet, she tells me that it's a client looking for a waste management associate. When I show up to the dump, the mid-August heat is so relentless that the creases I ironed into my pants melt away. By the time I arrive in the main office, I've reverted to a liquid state. My interviewer asks me how much I can haul, to which I respond with an overestimation of about 50 pounds. The vibe in the room a little bit Ku Klux until I go to the bathroom and see that for the length of my interview, the mascara has been running down my cheeks, and there are big black tears making their way down my face. There is something I want to tell Eric, but because of our gaping economic disparity, I don't know how to express myself without it seeming like I'm asking for help. So I send my social security to an email link to an office in Silicon Valley, where a popular in-app delivery system is based. In 3 days, they send me a hat and a carrier bag with thermal insulation to keep the deliveries warm. They grant me access to a map that shows the areas of the city with the highest demand. Heavily populated areas show up dark red, and less populated areas tend to remain pink until lunchtime, when demand is high even in the sleepy hamlets of Queens. I ride my bike to an address in Sunset Park, and when the customer comes to the door, she snatches the bag of waffle fries and doesn't tip. Most of the time I stay in Brooklyn. I get first orders of no-pulp orange juice and champagne out of the way, make pit stops for vanilla jewel pods, small orders of LaCroix and Pampers. I make my home base Holy Cross Cemetery so I can hydrate in relative peace, and also because it's smack dab in the middle of Flatbush and the orders come in from all sides. Technically, I'm not allowed to transport anything that qualifies as a drug, but there are prep school kids who need bubble tea and Marlboros, dog walkers who need boxed wine and leave detailed instructions about where in Prospect to make the drop, pump and dumping mommies who emerge from Grand Army Market, desperate for gin. Everyone is excited to see me, and I'm sort of excited to see them, the habitual Bensonhurst McFlurries, to Gen X brownstoners who for some reason use the app to order pizza, Coney Islanders looking to indulge in brunch from afar and who are just happy you came out, the West Indian pockets of Eastern Parkway and their cash-only ackee and cocoa bread, buku tips on the days I wear the company hat and beat the average time, though occasionally I take the bridge over and field requests by canal, where I try to protect orders of squid from all that direct sun. But for the visits I make, they never go beyond hello. I try to segue from light observations about the weather, and in the few who are receptive, between my strict schedule of work and sleep, I find I don't have the bandwidth to offer anything more. So I listen to NPR on my route and try to get some talking points. I find a segment about a journalist who received a string of violent emails in 2009. The journalist reads part of one email and laughs. She says, "He wrote to me on the 1st of every month, and he would say these things like, 'You redacted whore, how do men find you redacted?' And I felt like, it's not even constructive. If you have an issue with my reporting, okay." Then they bring the man who sent the emails on air, and he says, "I'm sorry, I was having a rough year." If I go home, it is usually for the bathroom I know and love, though there is a mom-and-pop Thai joint in Gravesend with a sterling private restroom, and they are so grateful for how much food I moved that they let me use it for free. I try not to take any deliveries with a high probability of soup, and I try to obey traffic laws, though sometimes there is a wedding, a parade, or a murder that forces me to rush and leave my bike in an illegal place. With a new diet of pear baby food and top ramen, I make almost enough money to live, though some of that is due to my payout from the publisher. Then I receive news that my rent is going up. The news comes in a brown, grease-stained envelope, and because I usually only receive mail from student loan consolidation scams and instant approval credit card companies that use old rap icons to target low-income blacks, I almost miss it. My roommate calls a meeting while I'm out falling from my bike into a customer's cheesecake. And as soon as I climb to the stairs, she is there with a suitcase, saying she's moving to a gut-renovated building in Harlem with her boyfriend, as "Send me a picture of your pussy" pings onto my screen. As I watch my roommate leave, the idea that I have a pussy seems preposterous. I move through the apartment and try to reconcile the existence of the clitoris with the broccoli smell my roommate left behind. I rinse the cheesecake from my hair and get out on my route, where the men who line the street remind me that technically, yes, I do have a pussy, and I will live with the terror protecting it for the rest of my life. But after a big haul of spices from Halal Food, I go ahead and take a picture of it in the bathroom of McDonald's. Then I go back to my newly empty apartment, Google utility SROs in the Bronx, and introduce some saline into my anal cavity. I watch Seinfeld, comb Jason Alexander's IMDb, and head to Manhattan to make a little more cash. I bike the Queensboro Bridge and mop my face and armpits in the bathroom of a Pret. I check the delivery map, and Uptown is already deep red, a swath of demand from Harlem to 59th and Lex for the matcha, milk, and hemp offerings of corporate, quirky, and decidedly snide coffee giants. The bike lanes in Manhattan already terrifying at 11 a.m., filled with delivery boys and girls who jet into traffic with fried rice and no reason to live, along with the sentient abdominals who do this for fun. Foreign pedestrians standing right in the way, taking their selfies and checking their luggage for pigeon shit. As far as Eric is concerned, there is no genital reciprocity. He sends a photo of himself holding a vial of powdered silver, and despite his general old manness regarding the art of the selfie and his dorky archival gloves, I want him. I have been waiting for a reason to rescind my attraction. I hoped in the 2 weeks we had been apart, I could be objective and find something wrong with him, but after this month, all I want is to be kissed. I ask my customers to confirm my name, at times just to be sure I have the right address, but mostly just to hear the sound. 5 bundles of kale for a customer on 8th floor walk-up in Flatiron, a vial of rose water for a customer in Greenwich Village whose labradoodle humps me down the stairs, Band-Aids and cigarillos for a customer who runs out of the Strand with a stiletto clutched in each hand, Chipotle every which way and always with no beans, 3 black wigs made of virgin Malaysian hair for a half-human, half-turquoise customer on Bowery, soggy Chelsea mailwomen with their tired roving eyes, white drug dealers in Sperry's waving to the NYPD, delivery people properly affiliated with pizza parlors and flower shops, all hooked in the peripheral intuition that keeps us all from falling into the city's bounty of open holes. Though now I walk over a subway grate and am excited by the possibility of it giving way, because despite the city's breakneck carousel, Despite the businessmen marching to my path and the elliptical assault of glass and steel and scary wooden trains in Upper East Side toy stores, I don't feel like I'm moving, even while I'm on my feet, up and down and in and out, and pressing a dollar slice directly into my large intestine. My parking job's incrementally more careless as the orders come 1, 2, 6, as I exit a sad Central Park studio at 12:53 a.m. and find my bike not gone per se, but divorced of both its wheels. So I take my basket and my bell and hold them in my lap on the F, the L, and the posthumous fart that is the B60 bus, asleep before I fall into bed, and then rise to my landlord, cum yogi, sucking an appetite-suppressant lollipop in my doorway, asking me to pay up or get out, and also namaste, before I take a cold shower and pay for one of those gargantuan city bikes, which tend not to be made for girls under 5'2", and so tend not to be conducive to punctual deliveries, or preventing you from careening into someone's gazpacho, or sprawling into a four-way intersection, ready to surrender the part of yourself that M-Train Mariachi hasn't already killed. Thank you. Yeah. So
We would love to take questions.
I would love to take some questions if there are any.
I have one. When I'm reading the novel, I find myself laughing out loud. And I almost feel sometimes like the narrator doesn't care if I find her funny or not. It's more than a dry humor. I'm quite not sure how to articulate it, but I was just curious how conscious you are of that humor, not just for her character, but for the novel and its and its subject matter.
Yeah.
Like, how did you approach the humor in that sense?
So there were definitely private jokes that I wanted to embed in the text, hoping that a reader would come across and feel that recognition, that I've been carrying around with me, like the freakiness of like a three-dimensional Mr. Clean, like that was just for me. But I do think like the humor, it comes from the friction between her resignation to like sort of hyperbole that is her life, that kind of casual violence that she kind of has to steel herself against to get through. There is sort of a natural pileup, and I didn't really realize that pileup until the book was finished and I started doing events, and I started talking about my general treatment of her as a character.
So
but
it's a bit protective. I'm sorry.
No.
It's a bit protective?
Yeah, I would say that it's that dissonance between the sort of the violence, the uppercaseness of her environment and the steel she kind of has to get through. And it also is, I think, a byproduct of the way I like to write, which I feel I want to say I do consciously, but is just me feeling my way through the page. I'm always writing toward a feeling of surprise, because that's what I really like and what resonates with me. And when I'm stuck, I think like the form that embodies that most is poetry. And that too is, like, surprise is a core of poetry and also comedy. And when I'm trying to get the words together, I'm writing toward, I want something that feels, I want it to end in a different place than I started. And so I think that the humor is that too, but it is that friction between these things that are happening to her and the way that she kind of has to weather it, but also a few jokes that I needed to put in the text.
Hi, first, thank you so much for coming. Luster was like my favorite novel of last year, so
Thank you.
It's amazing to hear you read it. I was wondering how much, I guess I've been thinking a lot about the kidney story. As many, I'm sure have been. And so I was wondering, kind of related to that, how much you think you can, pull from real life, and with the line, and just your thoughts on
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I feel like we can see now, like, there really don't seem to be any right answers to that. But I do think that part of writing is borrowing. And I say that feeling that you do owe those bits of life that exist in the text. You owe them kind of cover and respect in fiction. That's how I feel, even though there is a lot of me in the book. When the book came out, I had a million texts and calls from family who recognized themselves, like versions of themselves in the text. It's only natural that you pull from your life. And that's part of, when I was writing about her painting, part of what I was trying to get at is the closeness with which you look at the people that pass through your life, and the sort of natural inclination to turn that into art, and the kind of mercilessness of that, I think is just part of art making. But yeah, there is sort of a moral quandary in where the line is when you borrow. But yeah, I don't think I have like a solid answer. But I think you borrow with respect, but you write toward the truth. Like, that's the only thing that like feels like anything, I think. And sometimes the truth doesn't look good. So, yeah.
Well, you do your characters the tremendous respect of giving them a full complement of human frailties.
Thank you.
Like Edie is so flawed. They're also flawed. And I wonder, it's interesting to hear that your loved ones saw themselves in that characters, and if that created any kind of friction, or if you felt hesitant about sharing the story.
I would say, well, I just have kind of an unusual family situation. My mom, from the day that I started writing, and I was like writing poetry in my Tweety Bird diary, she was like, use everything, very much. Like, there's that Lori Moore story that I've forgotten the name of, but she's in the hospital, and it's based like heavily on her experience having a really sick young child. And throughout that story, there is this refrain of take notes, take notes, take notes. And I mean, that's the only way. There's a sort of like monstrousness of like, I think, trying to be an artist, being an artist and committing that life to the page. There's a monstrousness in taking notes, but for me, that is like my most optimal mechanism of understanding what it is. So it's a kind of processing, and it's craft, but it is a kind of processing. So I think it's just only natural. It's part of it.
I don't quite know how to ask this, but ever since reading your book maybe 6 months ago, it's been on my mind. There's like an element of the surreal in your book that I think is different from the contemporary authors that you were often placed next to. Like, for instance, somebody like Rooney or somebody who's also working with this like deep interiority and a real truth to humanity and to their characters, but with I don't know, you just capture something about the world that often when you look at the plot points in your book, they're surreal. They don't follow from reality. And is that something you were doing intentionally? Is that how you see the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that there is like a kind of surrealism that is realism. And there are aspects of the book, like a clown school. She goes to clown school to try and find a job. That's one of those things. You have these like private, these private things you want to work out in the text that you just want to be in your book that exists. But I do think that there is also a kind of delirium I'm writing into, and I think a character like Edie, sort of her consciousness sort of naturally lends to that atmosphere because she is treading water. I feel like that surrealism is a byproduct of a frantic and precarious state. But also, I think I also really, really love writing scenes that are all about motion and maybe not even much else. I love rhythm, and so that too is sort of a stylistic tick, maybe even. I love chaos, and so there are those scenes where there's music and there's Comic-Con, there's disco, and those are not necessarily the most realistic, you know, but they're ecstatic too. Like I kind of wanted to write toward those experiences as the way I feel them when I'm in it, which is kind of it's almost a religious experience, and that exists because I wanted to write joy too. I wanted the dark corners to exist, but I wanted those ecstatic experiences to exist too.
Thank you so much. So I noticed throughout the book that you were using some kind of more scientific language, not just in describing Rebecca's work, but also I think there's like a scene at a concert where you use the word scapula instead of on your shoulder. And I was wondering if, like, how much of that was intentional and how you feel these more scientific terms can like add to your work.
I think it just is. For me, those lines are probably lines that I spent, days and days and days on looking for, instead of this word, something that feels a little bit crooked. I just wanted something that is like a little bit more of a punch. So in some ways that is stylistic, but in other ways it is just fully part of my vocabulary. I worked for a long time at a multidisciplinary journal, scientific journal in DC. I worked in like neuroscience sections, and when I was an undergrad, I was a psychology major. And so the sort of terms of art, scientific terms of art, are just a part of me, and feel more concrete sometimes than like the simpler, more familiar word. But yeah, I think that also is that. And in terms of Rebecca's work, that too, my mom was a medical examiner, and I watched her work and take apart bodies. And so I think the short answer is that I kind of can access those terms of art because I wanted to, as closely as I could, write toward the experience of seeing that work, but also stylistic.
I had a question, and I'm sure you've gotten a lot of questions about this because your book came out during the pandemic, and as it was your first book, I'm sure you might have had ideas of what that experience of having a first book out would be like, versus and the fact that it was so successful too. But like, how do you feel like, did it change your relationship with the book in any way? Were there parts of it that were disappointing, but actually not disappointing over time once you thought about it?
It was, it wasn't anything like what I expected, because I worked in publishing also, like trade publishing for a long time, and I had a kind of understanding on how this process usually goes. When I worked with all the imprints, and so when the books came in, I would like read the first 3 pages and see, what books the publishers were buying and what books were being sort of put forward. And so I had a really managed expectation around what it would look like because I was on the other side for a long time. But then to publish in the pandemic was chaos, I should say. Like, it was, we were all, I think, trying to figure out, beyond books. Like, the book felt very, very small in that moment. It felt very strange to be thinking about the book as we were trying to figure out, grapple with what was happening. But having it out there was deeply vulnerable. I feel I had to adjust to that level of exposure. I take for granted the idea that writers by nature prefer to be on the other side, like with the open document, and that is definitely me. And so it took a while for me to get used to being a person alongside the book, this thing that was once private, and that's the only way I can write well, is to feel a certain privacy with the work, to not think about anything on the outside. That was totally obliterated, but I would say that it was deeply cool, because once it's out in the world, people see things in it that you didn't realize were in it. There's only a certain amount of distance I can have from it because I made it. And one of the best parts is that when it's out, people are rigorous and they see even things that are maybe unsettling that you didn't see. They see things in the book, and you learn things about your own work. And more literally, I feel like it's only now that I'm beginning to feel that, that community around like the release of some art into the world, because during the pandemic it was, me and the screen, and so like this didn't happen, and it feels really good to be in this part.
So when I was reading, one of the things that really struck me was how easy it was to fall into empathy and root for this protagonist. And that's the question that I most frequently get from students when I teach fiction. How do you balance virtue with transgression and create characters that are both compelling, but you can sort of identify as far away as like clown school may feel and root for them?
Well, I wanted to write away from virtue. I think that as the core part of this project, like even when I was beginning and I didn't really know what it was, I knew that the most important thing would be to try to write honestly toward how messy and contradictory it is or can be for a young Black woman to be reaching for that intimacy and reaching for that self-actualization and the right to make art. It was important. There's always this, I forget who said it, but like we need more dirtbag Black women. I remember seeing that somewhere, and I feel that that's sort of like the core, the kind of the core of the book. But also Morgan Parker, if you've read her, she's an amazing poet, and she has this poem, all they want is my body, my pussy, my blood. And there's one line in it that is, for me, was like, as I was writing, I was like, that's going to keep me going. That's like the thesis. And it was like, I do what I want because I could die at any time. I don't mean YOLO. I mean they are hunting me. And when I read those lines, I thought that's sort of it. I want to write toward that life that you're living, feeling that sort of specter of death, the kind of way your body is imperiled and the way that informs the way you act on the world. I didn't want her to be a static object that the world happens to. I wanted her to be active. And I think even that concept is deeply gendered and racialized, like in real life. That may be the more surreal component of the book. In real life, I can't go and let myself into my lover's house, but I wanted Edie to be a person who has agency and who is allowed to, within her sexuality, kind of exhibit contradictions that are, that are also kind of tempered by these like huge historical asterisks. But I wanted her more than anything to be free. Like as I was writing this and I was talking to my thesis advisor about the anxieties I had about writing toward dirty laundry, I guess is how sometimes it's framed. And she told me just to do what you want, like be free. And that was sort of the project. And I think in that, in letting a character be fallible and be wrong and have access to like the uglier, less, noble aspects of like bearing pain, there is empathy there. Yeah. If I answered your question.
Thank you.
I had a writing teacher once who, when a detail didn't quite land, she would say, well, you gotta notice something better. And that wasn't quite the right detail, notice something better. And the detail, just in the section you just read, between the, trying to keep the squid out of the sun and the graphics that the credit card companies would use on their mailers, like the detail is so spot on. What advice would you have for emerging writers about about that ability to notice something better?
I had a similar dynamic with a teacher. He would write on my drafts, like he would circle the detail. He'd go, "Do better," and he was right. I would say it's specificity is sort of what you're talking about, and that is like what we were talking about, where I do think that that feels more. There's nothing better than like opening a book or watching a movie and coming across like feeling that that moment of recognition. That person sees that exactly as I see that small thing, that thing that, that's sort of what I'm always writing toward, because it feels so good when I encounter it, and I don't think you get it when it's flat and when it's general. So I'm always writing as specifically as I can, even if that risks alienating. But I generally don't think that is what happens. I think what generally happens if you write specifically is the opposite. You kind of outstretch your hands and show the thing that you see that other people inevitably also see.
I think similarly, your characters always surprise me, like to the extent that I feel sort of spun around and I think, my God, she did what? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about making those decisions and pushing them to those difficult places that, seem inevitable within the confines of who they are, but are also just sort of head spinning.
I mean, I would say that like the non-sexy answer is, some of it is tension, is narrative tension, and is me wanting to push it as far as I can go, and having fun with it. But otherwise, it is. I'm writing toward that surprise, as we were talking about earlier. I really feel that the truest representations of like human people in text and in art are representations where they're surprising, where they're not familiar. Like there are, as I was writing this, I had the sort of archetypes of the characters, and I tried my best to write away from them. Like I understood how they would feel if they were familiar, and I tried to write away from that. But it just feels more true in my life with people more often than not. They surprise you. And yeah, I just wanted to make room for, those moments, because I do think that through those moments of surprise, there's connection. You get kind of knocked off balance, and a vulnerability kind of opens. And so that's why it was important for me to kind of write away from a familiar idea and kind of go for broke. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you talk about the prose itself? It seems to me the meter is also just so particular and varied and lovely and surprising. And it's like the details and the characters take these turns. But earlier when you were talking about picking a medical term, you talked about finding something a little more crooked, like spending a couple days wedging something into the line or something to give it that surprising feeling.
Yeah.
Like, how do you do it? And at what point do you do it? Like, do you do it instinctively? Do you do it in revision? Is it some torturous combination?
It's a torturous combination, I think. So how I write is really, really slowly. I wish I could. I still haven't fully accepted this about myself, because I would rather be able to write quickly and have a draft and it's messy and I come back but I write very slowly, in that I'm always listening to what it sounds like, and I think that people are split on whether that is like the ideal way to go about it. But if it doesn't feel right, if it doesn't sound right, I just feel it and I can't continue. So I kind of get stuck in these holes where I'm kind of grappling with like words and 3 sentences, 4 sentences, and I can't, like whenever I'm trying to describe what it feels like to write, it always feels like a little like lying, because it doesn't feel like something I'm fully in control of. it feels like an exorcism. That's the way I know how to describe it best. But I don't know, I'm always really interested in the texture of the word. I'm interested in those like sensory aspects of language. Those are the books that really excite me, that are kind of, that are keyed in on that triangulation. And so that's how I'm always writing. I'm just kind of trying to stuff as much in there that has feeling, I guess. But I think earlier I was talking about trying to write toward the surprise. I am always trying to write with generosity to a potential reader. I don't mean to write for your reader. I think you write for yourself. But I make, I think, compromises on the page with the hope that my reader will stick with me. I don't take for granted that that they'll turn the page. And so I feel like every bit, every page, I'm trying to create, put something there that will make the reader want to read forward towards something. So there is that structurally. But for me, it really is just, it's feeling. And the only thing I know when I'm working is this doesn't feel right, or it does. And I kind of just have to sit with it until it cracks. And it always does, but those moments are really often discouraging because it's such a slow and process and you have to be patient. But again, I do kind of want to say, like, you write how you write. And I don't think there's just like one way to do it. The one way to do it is the one that feels right. And I think you kind of know instinctively when something's wrong. So I'm writing toward that moment of this feels fully realized, and it's just a paragraph usually, and then I move on to the next. That's how I.
That's such a good and generous answer. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, if you don't mind answering a couple more.
Thank you. And I think a lot of the promotional material for this is said like your first novel. And so I think maybe first implies second or many more than that. So I'm kind of wondering, like, with having put this piece out into the world, is there any level of like satisfaction or like maybe even temporarily like satiating this desire to create, or is it like you've got it in and out wants more?
I do think that for a moment I did feel that satisfaction. I mean, I really, really got lucky with this book, and so there was that, but also in the writing of this, it was a sprint. It was a sprint. I wrote this. I mean, that passage that I read, I actually worked that job. Before I came back to go to the program to write, try and write full time. But I was working, and I was in school full time. And at night, I wrote Lester. I just tried to get one sentence out at a time with the slow writing that I do. And so by the time that it was finished and in the pipeline, I was ready to lay down. I was really, and that too is why I think the prose is how it is because I was in a moment where I just needed this to work. I really had like a lot of hope baked into this project, and so I think by the time it was out, it was a relief, and that's how I feel in general about most art I make. I'm precious about it until it's done, and then it feels like it's something that has been complete. But I will say that now that I've had like a moment, I am excited and only feel really truly normal when I'm working on something. And so now the hunger is back, but that was sort of complicated too, because there are moments I think where it's not as easy, and it's really easy to get done yourself when it's not as easy, but it comes back, and I'm there now, thankfully. Tomorrow, who knows?
What are you reading right now?
Oh man, I am reading for the first time actually. It's nonfiction, Hilton Nowell's White Girls, which I really dig. The Days of Aphrodite by Asali Solomon. It's like a slim volume and it's really, really beautiful. I love Hard Damage, the poetry collection by Aria Aber. Intimacies by Katie Kitamura. I mean, is just a brilliant, brilliant book. It writes about translation in a way that I've kind of always dreamed about ever since reading this Audre Lorde essay where she goes to Russia. And I'm reading a little Carl Phillips. My friend gave me that, and like I said, poetry is always a thing that kind of gets me unstuck. So yeah, that's a bunch, but that is sort of, I tend to read like a couple at a time. I like to.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.